So, I think the pandemic was and is a major once in a century crisis. And so I think the government had to have a commensurate response because otherwise, if they didn't, we might have had prolonged suffering or economic issues going forward.
In my opinion, much of the COVID relief that was passed was appropriate and necessary to combat the crisis. However, I do think that some of the latter bills, and in particular the American Rescue Plan, became a little bit more unfocused and probably should have been better targeted overall. My name is Mike Farquharson, and I'm a policy analyst at the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget here in Washington, D.C.
So hi, everyone. I'm Veronica Goodman, and I'm the Director of Social Policy at the Progressive Policy Institute, a center-left think tank in Washington, D.C.
Welcome to the Long Game Insight series with Up to Us, where we bring together federal budget experts, academics, and political commentators to discuss what they think about our country's long-term fiscal outlook. Moderated by our own Up to Us alumni, a diverse group of students and young professionals who care about a sustainable economic future, the goal of this series is not to persuade, convince, or assert, but to simply hear what the experts are saying about our long-term fiscal outlook, and to dig into the diverse array of opinions and insights around economic policies. Being a series dedicated to discussing our collective economic future, there's no bigger or more timely topic than COVID-19 and our fiscal response to it. It's no surprise to anyone that the COVID-19 pandemic is one of the worst public health emergencies in our lifetime and has caused global economic upheaval. In this previously recorded conversation, we dive into this topic to get the scoop from experts about how the government's response to COVID-19 will impact our long-term fiscal outlook. If there's one major takeaway here, it's that there are lots of unanswered questions. Here's what the experts had to say.
So that's a great question. I think it's different in many ways, but I'll focus on three in particular. First, because of the nature of the pandemic, it's truly been a global economic event and reached almost every country in the world. And it spread very quickly across the globe, and so many people have been affected. At the end of last year, a majority of countries were in a recession. Second, as opposed to past pandemics, we've been lucky in terms of the way that technology has played a role in being available to us as we social distance, connecting with friends and family over Zoom, like we're doing now, working from home. For example, those of us that could afford it were able to order groceries and have them delivered to our homes. But I think it's important to also note in that vein that access to these technologies is concentrated at the higher ends of the income distribution. And that really shines a light on some of the inequalities in the US. For example, working professionals could more easily work from home, but a lot of our essential workers had to be more exposed to the virus. And because schools and childcare centers were closed, kids were at home with parents. And I know from personal experience how difficult that's been. Third, another aspect of the technology is that the pandemic stands to accelerate or disrupt certain trends, such as the way people work, the way people buy things and shop, how kids learn. And it'll be interesting to see how these play out and what role government will have to take to mitigate its effects. As a final point, I think it's worth noting that, at least in the US, before the pandemic, the economy was in relatively good shape. And so I'm feeling hopeful now, especially that we have a new administration, that as the virus wanes over the next few months, the economy will come back.
So I think it was unique in a number of different ways. I think, first of all, the nature of the crisis. So we essentially put the economy into a self-induced coma with the initial lockdowns in response to the pandemic. So in some ways, what we had was a kind of engineered recession. Secondly, the scale of the crisis was very historic, and we can see this if we compare it to the Great Recession. So the unemployment rate during the Great Recession peaked at 10% in October 2009. And this increase in unemployment happened relatively gradually, so over the course of 2 years, compared to today's crisis, where unemployment actually rose from 4.4% in March to 14.7% in April. So that's a 10.3 percentage point increase in just 1 month. Real gross domestic product also fell during the global financial crisis from its peak in December 2007 to its trough in 2009 by 4.3%. Real GDP fell over 10% through the first half of last year. So you can see the scale and magnitude of this crisis. I think thirdly, the swiftness and the scale of the fiscal and monetary response during COVID is unique. So lawmakers were quick to pass trillions of dollars in COVID relief, and the Federal Reserve quickly took actions to lower the federal funds rate to zero, and now obviously restart some of the emergency liquidity and credit facilities that occurred during the Great Recession. And also they created new ones after the enactment of the CARES Act. So again, comparing to the Great Recession, from 2008 to 2012, the federal government enacted around 1.8 trillion of net fiscal stimulus. And this was equivalent to around 2.4% of GDP at that time. Whereas between the major bills enacted to date to tackle the COVID crisis, the federal government has enacted policies that will cost over 5 trillion over 5 years, much of this in the very short term. And that's equivalent to around 4.4% of GDP. Again, showing the magnitude.
Yeah, so it does inform how we think about policy options. I think the need is to target help and aid for those that are getting left behind, both before the pandemic, but also after. So kids, especially low-income students, will experience learning losses because schools were closed, and many did not have access to the technologies that we just talked about to keep up with virtual learning. Another group is the gap in unemployment for non-college educated workers has only worsened during the pandemic. And so we need to think about how we make the recovery and future growth more equitable and not leave anybody behind. And on the flip side, the pandemic has been sort of this inadvertent experiment that's taught us a lot of lessons about getting help to families. For example, there were really high elevated levels of hunger during the COVID recession. We saw mile-long lines outside of food banks, and policymakers made food assistance easier for schools to distribute, as well as other changes in rules. And if you actually have a graph of the food scarcity levels for households across the different weeks of the pandemic, and you just put a line where government aid went out, it really just drops. And it's now at levels, back to before the pandemic. So that's really good. And it shows that that is working.
So as a result of the massive stimulus in response to the crisis, I think we now have to take a step back, sort of reevaluate our fiscal situation. So to set the stage a little bit, now that the American Rescue Plan Act has been signed into law, the federal deficit this year is on course to reach $3.4 trillion. And this is higher than last year's $3.1 trillion deficit. So not only this, but we have long-term imbalances in spending and revenue in the coming years. Revenue is expected to average 17.6% over the next decade. And this is around its historic average of 17.4%. However, spending is going to average around 22.3% under current law, above its historic average of 20.6%. So we have a constant imbalance between spending and revenues. And so as we move to a post-COVID economy, I think we really need to reevaluate our fiscal situation in that context and start to think about how we can adjust our spending and revenues so that debt can be sustainable in the medium and the long term. So in my opinion, much of the COVID relief that was passed was appropriate and necessary to combat the crisis. However, I do think that some of the latter bills, and in particular, the American Rescue Plan, became a little bit more unfocused and probably should have been better targeted overall. An additional unwelcome effect that we might now have to monitor, just as a result of the sheer size of the American Rescue Plan in the context of the economic recovery, is subsequent inflationary pressures. And you might have read about this in the media and in other circles. If it's not controlled, it could become an issue for the economy.
Yes, I do, but I think it's all about, at the end of the day, how you pay for it. So I think the pandemic was and is a major once in a century crisis, and so I think the government had to have a commensurate response, because otherwise, if they didn't, we might have had prolonged suffering or economic issues going forward. I also hope that we continue to think about these as national investments in kids and families, and people that they're getting left behind, and that ultimately, in some way, these do reduce the costs and spur economic growth going into the future.
So I think we need to start pragmatically thinking about how to create a sustainable fiscal future, because the longer policymakers wait to fix the debt, the harder and costlier it will be. So policymakers in 2025 would need to enact tax increases or spending cuts equivalent to 3.6% of GDP to restore debt to 2019 levels by 2050. If policymakers wait until 2035, so 10 years later, it would require tax and spending changes equivalent to 5.9% of GDP to achieve the same result. The last time debt was this high, just after World War II, as I mentioned before, the debt did decline rapidly, and that was due to very robust economic growth and near balanced budgets. However, today we have an aging population, which means lower future growth than during that time, and it sort of adds to the need for structural fiscal change. I think number two is that we need to make solvent our nation's major trust funds. So some of our nation's most important government programs are financed with dedicated revenue sources using federal trust funds. And actually 4 of these programs are within 14 years of insolvency. So what does this mean? It means that insolvency of these trust funds would trigger a 7% cut to disability benefits, a 13% cut in Medicare payments, 25% cut in highway spending, and an across-the-board 27% cut in Social Security retirement benefits. Restoring trust fund solvency not only has the effect of restoring solvency to these programs and making sure that we don't trigger these benefit cuts, but it also improves the fiscal outlook, could also boost economic and income growth. And they also offer an opportunity, I think, for us to strengthen retirement security, continue to support disabled workers, lower overall healthcare costs. That's something that's still a very bipartisan issue on the Hill. And it could be, let's say. We could improve infrastructure spending and financing, reduce income inequality, and reform taxes as well. So in sum, I would like lawmakers to think more about the big picture and the long term, and not just about today's spending and consumption priorities. I think long-standing policy priorities should not be deficit financed, but paid for in a considerate and sustainable way. We have a saying here at CRFB, if something is worth doing, it's worth paying for.
I mean, I don't think I have anything that will be mind-blowing to policymakers, but I do think that it's good to think big and ambitious, and that's why I'm really excited about President Biden's Build Back Better agenda. But we also need to think about pay-fors, and it might not be feasible to get all of these priorities implemented this year. So we'll have to think about where are the priorities, what should be first in line, because I think it's important to not let perfect be the enemy of the good.
So I enjoy thinking about the difficult economic and fiscal challenges of the day. I get a lot of satisfaction from publishing unique analyses and facts without bias on a particular budget or fiscal issue. Federal budget, fiscal issues are so impactful to people across the country. And I believe that, what we prioritize as a nation has an effect on each and every one of us. So getting to work on these issues day in and day out is really incredibly fulfilling and meaningful. And, as a small organization, I also like to think we sort of punch above our weight. And I really believe that's down to sort of the quality and swiftness of our analysis. And I get to work with super bright people every day, very dedicated to what they do and what we believe in as an organization. And it's incredibly exciting to work here.
So I really love my job and my work, so that's really motivating. But I do believe in the power of research and evidence to inform our policymaking process and the way we think about social and economic challenges, and really helping working families and creating a more equitable society. Also, I have 2 young kids myself, and so as a parent and as a mom, as a lot of people are, they're kept up at night thinking constantly about their future and really how we can make it a better country and world for their generation.